It was 7:42 in the morning, August 17, 1943. Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched beneath the wing of a P-38 Lightning at Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea, wiping the humidity from his brow as he watched his pilot get ready for takeoff. He knew what that look on the young man's face meant. Lieutenant Robert Hayes was about to fly into a fight he might not come back from. Hayes was only 23. 6 missions under his belt, not a single confirmed kill yet. And today, 18 Japanese Zero fighters were already climbing into the sky to meet the Americans head-on. McKenna had been working on Lightnings for 8 long months. He could strip one down to its bones and rebuild it blindfolded. 2 engines, twin booms, fast as hell in a dive, unstoppable in a climb. But there was one problem he couldn't fix. The P-38 couldn't turn with a Zero. The Japanese planes were lighter, sharper, and could whip around in half the space it took the Lightning to bank. It wasn't just a design flaw, it was a death sentence. Every P-38 pilot was drilled with the same warning. Never turn with a Zero. Hit fast, pull up, and get out. Don't play their game. But theory doesn't always survive the sky. Hayes had tried that hit-and-run strategy 5 times, and the enemy always seemed to find a way to pull him into a turn he couldn't win. 37 P-38s had gone down in just 6 weeks. McKenna had watched their names come off the board, one by one. Brave boys turned ghosts. The manuals blamed pilot error. The instructors said the men weren't following orders. But McKenna knew it wasn't that simple. He'd seen it firsthand, under the panels, inside the wings. The problem wasn't courage. It was cables. The Lightning's aileron controls snaked through the booms to the tail and back out to the wings, and somewhere in that run, a tiny bit of slack, barely a fraction of an inch, created just enough lag for disaster. At high speed, no one noticed, but in a tight, slow turn, that half-second delay could mean the difference between staying alive or spinning into a fiery cloud. 2 months earlier, McKenna had tried to report it. The engineering officer brushed him off. "It's within spec," they said. "Factory tolerances allow it." Changing it, he was told, would void the Lockheed warranty. So McKenna made a choice. One he wasn't supposed to make. He took a scrap of piano wire from a wrecked Lightning, bent it carefully into a Z shape, and used it as a tensioner on Hayes's left aileron control cable. It was a field fix, illegal, unapproved, and against every regulation in the Army Air Force's manual. It took him 8 minutes. 8 quiet, defiant minutes that might just decide whether Lieutenant Hayes lived through the day. The wire McKenna added weighed almost nothing. 4/10 of a pound of tension, that's all. But it erased the slack completely. No one saw it. No one even thought to look. The inspection crew that morning was busy with the usual, checking oil levels, topping ammunition, marking fuel loads. Nobody checked the aileron tension. Nobody ever did. McKenna just stood there, saying nothing, hands in his pockets as Hayes rolled down the strip and lifted into the pale New Guinea sky. The sound of those twin Allisons faded, until there was nothing left but the jungle hum. 17 minutes later, everything would change. Not just for Hayes, not just for McKenna, but for every P-38 mechanic in the Pacific. The memory of why he'd done it went back to another morning, July 9, 1943. That was the day Lieutenant David Chen didn't come home. Chen was one of McKenna's favorites. They'd spent weeks working together on the same plane, talking about cars in California. Chen from Sacramento, McKenna from Long Beach. 2 grease monkeys who'd ended up in the war. Chen had taken off at 6:15 for a fighter sweep over Leh. 2 hours later, he came back alive but shaken, his Lightning chewed by 3 bullet holes tight in the left boom. He told McKenna how a Zero had slipped inside his turn. He'd tried to brake and dive, just like the manual said, but the controls felt sluggish. Like the airplane hesitated before responding. A heartbeat of delay that almost killed him. The only thing that saved Chen was his wingman getting the zero first. McKenna remembered inspecting those holes. Tight and perfect. Just like the Zero pilot had predicted every move. That shouldn't happen, he'd muttered. Not if the roll was instant. But it did. And 3 weeks later, word came back from Rabaul. Chen was gone. Another turning fight. Same delay. Same end. Then came Captain William Morrison. He wasn't a rookie. 11 kills. Smart, disciplined, calm in the air. If anyone could keep a P-38 alive in a turning fight, it was him. August 3rd, 12,000 feet over Oro Bay. Morrison led his flight into 8 Japanese Zeros. He nailed one on the first pass, then swung around for another attack. 2 Zeros reversed on him, fast and tight. Over the radio, the flight heard his voice cut in. Controls feel heavy, sluggish. Seconds later, his P-38 rolled over to escape, but not fast enough. The Zeros stayed glued to him all the way down. They opened fire at 4,000 feet. Morrison never pulled out. When the wreckage came back, McKenna's friend Rodriguez, Morrison's crew chief from Texas, tore the plane apart looking for answers. Engine, hydraulics, rigging, control lines. Everything was within spec. And that's what broke McKenna. Within spec had killed 2 good men. There was nothing wrong with the airplane. At least, that's what the paperwork said. The official report called it pilot error. Rodriguez didn't buy it. Neither did McKenna. By mid-August, McKenna had watched 17 pilots die. Some he'd shared cigarettes and stories with. Others he only knew by the names he scrawled on maintenance logs. But he'd signed off on every one of their planes. He'd watched them taxi out, engines screaming, wheels lifting. And sometimes he'd watch their empty revetments that evening, knowing they weren't coming back. The survivors all said the same thing. The P-38 just felt slow. Not broken, not dangerous. Just a half beat behind the pilot's hands when things got tight. A small lag between motion and response, like the airplane was thinking about what to do instead of doing it. Most men chalked it up to weight. Big fighter, big controls, sluggish in the turns. But McKenna knew that was wrong. He could feel that hesitation in the cables when he worked on them. He could hear it. When he checked tension, the cables made a faint low twang. And every lightning on the line sang the same off-key note. They were all just a little loose, still within tolerance, according to the factory, but not tight enough for war. One evening, not long after Morrison's death, McKenna told Rodriguez what he'd noticed. Rodriguez asked, "So what can we do?" McKenna stared at the ground for a while before saying quietly, "Nothing. At least, not officially." He explained his idea. A tiny, unauthorized tweak that could tighten the controls and erase that deadly delay. It was simple, but it was also illegal enough to get them both court-martialed. The truth was, the problem wasn't the pilots. The men knew what they were supposed to do. They'd been drilled until it was second nature. Don't ever turn with a zero. Use your speed, your altitude, hit fast, climb out. Doctrine was gospel, but doctrine doesn't fight back. The enemy does. Lieutenant Robert Hayes understood that better than anyone. 23 years old, farm boy from Iowa, 6 missions in, and not a single victory. Not because he couldn't shoot, because the rules never gave him a chance to. On his 3rd mission, he did everything by the book. Came in from the sun, diving at 400 miles an hour. Perfect attack angle. Got the zero in his sights, started to lead for the shot. Then the Japanese pilot snapped left and dropped out of sight. Hayes rolled after him, but the P-38 felt like it was swimming through syrup. By the time he leveled, the enemy was gone. He climbed away, guns cold, heart pounding. On his 4th mission, it got worse. Hayes and his wingman bounced 2 zeros at 15,000 feet. Hayes fired first, missed by a hair. The lead Zero flipped right in a hard reversal, and just then, two more appeared from above. Hayes tried to roll back and dive out, but the controls lagged, just long enough for one of the diving Zeros to rake his right boom with cannon fire. The shells didn't punch through, but they rattled him, scared him in a way he'd never admit over the radio. He limped home, trailing smoke, shaken but alive. By the fifth mission, he wasn't the same. He'd stopped trusting the airplane, and that day he watched his wingman die. His wingman was Lieutenant Thomas Parker, 21, from Boston. Hayes and Parker had trained together, shared tents, jokes, and the same uneasy dreams before missions. On August 14th, over Finchhafen, Parker got cut off from the formation. Two Zeros slid onto his tail, and no amount of skill could shake them. Hayes heard it all over the radio. Parker's breathing turning into panic, his voice breaking as he shouted for help. His voice breaking as he shouted for help. "I can't turn with them. She's too slow." Then came the gunfire. A scream. Silence. That night, nobody slept. Parker's cot stayed empty, his locker cleared out before dawn. The paperwork said his P-38 went down in combat. The official reason? Pilot error during evasive maneuvering. McKenna had serviced that airplane that very morning, checked the plugs, the timing, the cable tension. Everything was perfect. And yet Parker died anyway. McKenna knew exactly why. That fraction of a second delay in the controls, the tiny slack that the manuals said was acceptable. It wasn't acceptable. It was lethal. It had killed Chen. It had killed Morrison. And now it had killed Parker, too. The worst part wasn't even the death reports. It was the mornings. Every dawn, McKenna stood in that same maintenance bay, surrounded by the thick, sour smell of fuel and hot metal. The hangar buzzed with engines warming up, men shouting over the roar of propellers, the hum of hydraulic pumps. It all smelled like war, that same smell that meant some of these machines would never come home. He'd stand there, tightening, bolts on the same aircraft that had already taken too many good men away, knowing exactly what the next few hours would bring. Then came the evening of August 16th. Hayes walked into the hangar, still in his flight suit, eyes hollow from too many funerals. He found McKenna bent over his Lightning, wiping grease off his hands. "Is there anything you can do to make her roll faster?" Hayes asked. He wasn't angry, just desperate. He said he didn't care about the rules anymore. He just wanted a chance. One real chance to fight and survive. McKenna looked at him for a long moment, saw a kid pretending to be a soldier, saw the fear trying to hide behind his voice. Finally, he said, "Come back in the morning. I'll see what I can do." That night, McKenna stayed behind alone. By 11 p.m., the hangar was silent, except for the low rumble of generators and the steady buzz of insects slamming into the lights. The air was thick with oil and tropical humidity. He knelt beside Hayes's Lightning, unbolted the inspection panel on the left boom, and reached inside. The metal still held the day's heat. When he pulled on the aileron cable, he could feel it. That soft give before the tension bit, maybe 3/8 of an inch of play. His hands were slick with grease, his knuckles raw, but he didn't need a gauge to tell him it was wrong. He felt it. From the corner of his workbench, he pulled out a short length of piano wire he'd salvaged from a wrecked P-38 2 weeks earlier. 6 inches of high-tensile steel, scavenged from the rudder trim system of an aircraft that had long since been written off. McKenna turned it in his hands, studying the shine of the metal under the lamp. Then he reached for his pliers. He'd kept that scrap of piano wire in his tool bag for months, never knowing why he hadn't tossed it out. Now he understood. McKenna sat cross-legged on the hangar floor, sweat running down his back even though the night was cool. He pulled the wire out, grabbed a pair of pliers, and started bending. It was tough metal, springy, stubborn. His grip slipped twice. The second time, it sliced his thumb. Blood slicked the wire. He wiped it on his coveralls and kept working. It took him 8 minutes to shape it into the crude little Z he needed, just enough to preload the control cable and take out the slack. A tiny thing, but maybe the difference between life and death for Hayes. Getting it installed was the real fight. There was barely any room inside the boom. He had to reach in with one hand while holding a flashlight with the other. The beam kept shaking, shadows dancing across the cable system. His shoulder pressed against the metal frame, the edge digging into his skin. He could feel his heartbeat in his fingertips. He disconnected the cable at the pulley, fumbled the tiny clevis pin, dropped it. It clinked somewhere in the dark. He froze, listening, then spent 5 long minutes groping through the narrow space until his hand found it again. Every second he stayed there was a risk. If the engineering officer caught him modifying a flight control system without orders, he'd be done. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, maybe even prison. But if he didn't act, Hayes might not come back from tomorrow's mission. He wedged the homemade Z-tensioner between the pulley and the cable, forced the pin back through. It fought him all the way, but it finally seated. He tugged on the cable. No slack. The surface moved immediately. Perfect. He wiped the blood from the wire, closed the inspection panel, packed up his tools, and walked out of the hangar at 011 The tropical air was still and heavy. Far off, he could hear engines, Japanese bombers on a night run, probably. The sound made his stomach twist. He'd just broken every rule in the book, and if that wire failed mid-flight, the blame would be his alone. But if it worked, Hayes might live. McKenna lay awake in his bunk until dawn, staring at the ceiling, replaying every step in his head. At 06:30, he walked to the flight line, watched the ground crew fuel and arm the P-38s, watched Hayes climb the ladder, helmet under one arm, confident as ever. At 07:42, the squadron took off. McKenna stood there as the P-38s lifted into the pale morning sky, 16 silver shapes banking toward the northwest, toward enemy airspace. Then came the waiting. At 08:14, radio reports crackled in. Hayes and Theets, Flight of 4 had made contact. 9 zeros over Huon Gulf, 13,000 feet. Sun behind them. Perfect setup. Hayes was number 3 in formation. His lead called the attack, and they rolled in. Hayes picked a trailing 0, dove hard, speed climbing past 380 mph. The rising sun emblem filled his gun sight, the pilot's head just visible in the canopy. He fired. 50 calibers and a 20mm cannon thundered. Tracers cut through the air, wide at first, then closer. A few hits sparked off the Zero's wing, not enough to bring it down. The enemy snapped right and dove. Hayes followed. That's when he felt it. The plane moved like it had been waiting for him. No hesitation, no slop, just pure response. The stick rolled, and the aircraft followed instantly. For the first time, it felt alive. He swung the nose down, 0 centered in the sight. One more burst. 3 seconds. The round stitched up the fuselage, from tail to cockpit. Then the Zero's engine erupted. Flames, smoke, debris tumbling through the sky. The Japanese fighter rolled upside down, trailing a long, dirty ribbon of smoke as it plunged toward the jungle. Hayes's first kill, but he didn't have time to feel proud. "Bandits! 3 high, diving!" his wingman shouted. Hayes jerked his head up. 3 Zeros were coming down fast, sunlight flashing off their wings. They'd seen him take out their comrade, and were coming to settle the score. He shoved both throttles forward, engines roaring as the lightning surged upward. But the Zeros were faster in the dive. They'd be on top of him in seconds. Running wasn't going to work. Every bit of training said, keep climbing, don't turn, don't fight them head on. But training wasn't going to save him today. He rolled left, hard. The P-38 snapped through the sky like it was wired to his thoughts. He pulled into the turn, the horizon spinning past the canopy. The lead Zero tried to follow. Too slow. It was exposed. Hayes pulled a bit of lead and squeezed the trigger. The guns hammered, and the Zero's left wing folded in half. It disintegrated in a cloud of black smoke. 2 kills in half a minute. The other 2 came at him from opposite sides, trading turns in a tight scissors. They were trying to bait him into overshooting. Hayes stayed calm, stayed inside them. Every time they reversed direction, his P-38 rolled instantly, smooth and exact. No slack, no delay, just pure control. It felt like a brand-new airplane, light and alive in his hands. 1 Zero over-rotated, bled too much speed. Hayes slid in behind it, barely 200 feet away. He fired a 2-second burst. The tracers walked right through it. The fighter disintegrated. Bits of fuselage slammed against his right boom, rattling the lightning. 3 kills. The last Zero turned tail and ran for the clouds. Hayes didn't chase. His ammo counters were low, fuel even lower. He leveled off, climbed back to altitude, and found what was left of his flight. Together, they headed home. The fight had lasted barely 7 minutes. At 0903, Hayes rolled to a stop at Dobodura Airstrip. McKenna was already there, waiting by the flight line, hands still streaked with grease. Hayes shut down the engines, climbed down from the cockpit, and pulled off his helmet. His face was pale, his hands trembling. He walked straight to McKenna, leaned in close, and said quietly, "It worked." Neither of them knew 6 other pilots had seen everything from above. Captain Frank Mitchell, flight leader in the 475th Fighter Group, had watched the engagement from 15,000 feet. He'd seen Hayes's lightning move like nothing he'd ever witnessed, snapping through rolls and reversals twice as fast as any other P-38 in the theater. Mitchell knew all his men, knew their limits. Hayes was skilled, sure, but not superhuman. Something was different about that airplane. After landing, Mitchell found Hayes in the debrief room, still buzzing with adrenaline, hands shaking as he filled out his combat report. 3 confirmed kills. Mitchell asked what had changed. Hayes shrugged. "I don't know, she just handled better today. Faster." "Maintenance do anything unusual?" Mitchell pressed. Hayes thought for a moment, then said, "You might want to talk to McKenna." 2 hours later, Mitchell found the sergeant back in the maintenance bay, elbow deep in another lightning. His coveralls were soaked with oil and hydraulic fluid. Mitchell didn't waste words. "What did you do to Hayes's aircraft?" McKenna froze, met his eyes for a long moment, and finally said, "I added something that wasn't in the manual, a piano wire tensioner, an unauthorized fix to the control cable." Mitchell said nothing, just listened, the whine of distant engines echoing through the hangar. When McKenna finished explaining what he'd done, Mitchell didn't scold him. He just nodded slowly and asked one simple question. "Can you do it to mine?" McKenna hesitated. "Yes, but you need to understand what that means. It's not approved, it's not tested, and if it fails, it's both our necks on the line. I'm talking court-martial, maybe worse." Mitchell didn't flinch. He'd buried 4 of his own pilots that month, all caught in turning fights they couldn't win. Regulations hadn't saved them. "Do it," he said. "If it helps one of us come home, I'll take the risk." That night, under the dim yellow lights of the maintenance hangar, McKenna worked on Mitchell's Lightning. Same piano wire, same bent Z-shape, same secret fix. When Mitchell took the aircraft up at dawn, The results were instant. He came back from his test flight grinning like a man reborn. "She rolls like she's alive," he told his wingman. "Not fighting me anymore, just moving with me." Word spread fast. Pilots talk, wingmen talk faster. By August 20th, McKenna had done 9 of them. Pilots were showing up at his workbench after hours, asking if the stories were true, if the rumor about a magic wire was real. Some crew chiefs refused outright, quoting regulations and inspection codes. Others just nodded quietly, rolled up their sleeves, and asked McKenna to show them how. It wasn't complicated. Cut the piano wire, bend it just right, slip it into the cable run. Tension by feel. 8 minutes of work that changed everything. Soon, the mod was moving faster than any order ever could. No paperwork, no engineering memos, just whispered advice between mechanics in the shade of a wing, or in the ready room before a mission. Hayes scored 2 more kills on August 22nd. Mitchell bagged 3 on the 25th. Others followed. Flight after flight, pilots who'd been lucky just to make it home started bringing back confirmed kills. Then it spread beyond Dobodura. Lieutenant James Watkins, a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group up at Guinea, heard about it from a pilot who'd rotated through. Watkins didn't believe it, not until he tried it himself. His test pilot came back the next day with his first victory in 2 months of combat. Watkins converted 4 more aircraft. Within a week, other crew chiefs at Guinea were doing the same. By early September, maybe 40 P-38s across New Guinea carried McKenna's secret. The engineering officers began to suspect something, but they couldn't pin it down. Every inspection showed the cables within limits. The mechanics just removed the wire before checks and slipped it back afterward. The pilots knew. The crew chiefs knew. Nobody said a word to command, but the numbers spoke for them. In July, American pilots in the Pacific were losing 2 Lightnings for every 0 they downed. By August, it was almost even. By September, the ratio had flipped. Something invisible had changed the game. And then the Japanese noticed too. Reports from the 11th Air Fleet started mentioning that P-38s were rolling faster, reversing harder, and breaking out of traps that should have been fatal. Tactics that had worked for months were suddenly useless. The Americans hadn't received new aircraft or new engines, only a few feet of scavenged piano wire, installed by men who refused to watch another pilot die for a rulebook. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's deadliest aces. 64 kills, decades of experience in the air. Every move he made had been honed since Pearl Harbor. On September 3, 1943, over Wewak, Sakai locked onto a P-38. He executed his standard tactic. Draw the American into a turning fight. Wait for the Lightning to start rolling, then snap back to cut inside its turn. Every timing, every angle, he knew it by heart. But this P-38 didn't follow the script. It reversed with him. Sakai's heart slammed in his chest. He barely avoided a head-on collision. Guns rattled. Smoke trailed from his wing as he yanked the 0 away, frustrated and confused. He had faced countless P-38s before, but never one like this. Reports trickled in from other Japanese pilots. Same story. The Americans weren't flying differently. The planes weren't faster in a straight line. The pilots weren't superhuman. But the aircraft were responding faster in the crucial split seconds that turned life into death. The timing the Japanese had relied on for years was gone. Japanese intelligence scoured wreckage from downed P-38s. Engines, armaments, airframe, all standard. Nothing had changed. What they didn't know, couldn't see, was hidden in the twin boom. A 6-inch piece of piano wire bent and installed to eliminate slack in the control cables. Invisible, unassuming, deadly. By mid-September, the effect was undeniable. Japanese pilots, once supreme in every turning fight, were losing aircraft at alarming rates. The confidence that had let them dominate the skies for 2 years was eroding. Pilots who used to press attacks now hesitated, unsure if their tactics would work. Some adapted by avoiding tight turning fights, trying hit-and-run maneuvers instead, fighting on American terms. But that meant surrendering the one advantage the Zero had: agility. Others tried to force the old tactics, closing in closer and taking more risks. Too often it was fatal. Experienced aces went down in September, doing what had worked flawlessly in July. The problem was simple. They were fighting something they couldn't see. They knew something had changed, but the modification was invisible. And you can't craft counter-tactics against a secret no one knows exists. By the end of September, the numbers spoke for themselves. 38 Japanese fighters lost against P-38s, while American losses were 22. For the first time in the Pacific War, Lightnings were out-killing Zeros. The Japanese command finally ordered pilots to avoid P-38s unless they had overwhelming numbers. The hunter had become the hunted, and it all came down to a 6-inch piece of piano wire that shouldn't have been there, installed by a single maintenance sergeant who refused to watch another pilot die. The modification never became official. It wasn't until October 1943 that the Army Air Force Engineering Command learned about it, when a maintenance inspector at Dobodura noticed inconsistent cable tensions. By then, the war in the skies of New Guinea had quietly shifted, all because of one man's defiance and one small, clever tweak. The discrepancies didn't go unnoticed for long. A maintenance inspector traced them back to the piano wire tensioners, wrote a careful report, and sent it up the chain of command. For 3 weeks, the report sat on desks while officers argued. The modification broke regulations, yes, but it worked. Pilots were surviving. Squadrons using it were scoring more kills. The question wasn't whether it worked. It clearly did. The question was whether to punish the mechanics who had done what no one else dared, or quietly accept it and move on. In November, Lockheed sent an engineering team to New Guinea. They ran tests, measured cable tension, calculated stress loads, and flew the planes. Their verdict was clear. The modification was safe, effective, and should have been part of the original design. Lockheed integrated a similar tensioning system into the P-38J that rolled off the production line in December 1943.
But McKenna, he never received official credit. No medal, no commendation, no mention in any report. Lockheed's official documents credited engineering improvements. The mechanic who had saved dozens of lives didn't appear anywhere. Lieutenant Robert Hayes survived the war. 63 combat missions, 11 kills. He returned to Iowa in 1945, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and worked as a crop duster for 37 years. Every August 17th, without fail, he called McKenna to thank him for saving his life. Captain Frank Mitchell also survived. He rose to squadron commander, led his unit through the Philippines campaign, shot down 16 enemy aircraft, and retired as a colonel in 1963. He never failed to tell every young maintenance officer about McKenna's piano wire, teaching them that sometimes the smartest solutions come from the hands of enlisted mechanics who see what the engineers miss. McKenna left the Army Air Force in 1946 and returned to California. By 1948, he opened his own garage in Long Beach, working on cars and engines for the next 42 years. He rarely spoke of the war. If asked, he'd shrug and say, "I was a mechanic. Fixed airplanes, that's all." It wasn't until 1991, when a military historian uncovered references to the piano wire in New Guinea maintenance logs, that McKenna's story resurfaced. At 73, still tinkering in his garage, he confirmed the tale. "It wasn't anything special," he said. "Just something that needed doing." The historian estimated that McKenna's tiny modification had likely saved between 80 and 100 American pilots. McKenna never counted. He just remembered the faces of those who came home: Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, and the others. That was enough. James McKenna died in 2006 at age 88. He was buried in Pacific View Memorial Park in California. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic. It did not mention the piano wire tensioner. It did not mention that, with his hands and a piece of wire, he had changed the way American fighters fought and saved countless lives. It never mentioned that McKenna had broken every regulation to save lives. His Long Beach garage still stands, though under new ownership. In the back office, there's a faded photograph, a young mechanic in coveralls, standing proudly beside a P-38 Lightning. Written on the back, August 1943, New Guinea. That's how innovation happens in war. Not through committees or official channels, but through sergeants and mechanics who see a problem, take action, and don't wait for permission to save lives. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the battlefield tale. Subscribe to stay connected to these untold histories. Everyone matters, everyone deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Our community stretches from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.